Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, we could soon be holding the Biden administration accountable for what many of us believe is the government colluding with big tech to censor dissenting information and people. Take a look at this tweet from Missouri's Attorney General Eric Schmidt. Breaking, a federal court granted our request for discovery and documents from top-ranking Biden officials and social media companies to get to the bottom of their collusion to suppress and censor free speech. No one has had the chance to look under the hood before now we do. Okay, so let me tell you about the lawsuit, and then we'll break it down a bit. Now, Missouri's Attorney General Eric Schmidt filed a lawsuit back in May against Joe Biden and others, such as Jen Psaki, Anthony Fauci, Nina Jankowicz, Vivek Murthy, the CDC, NIH, and several others, claiming they colluded with big tech to censor people and information they didn't like. Essentially, the allegation is the government, unable to silence critics on their own, used big tech to do their dirty bidding. Specifically, the suit states that officials in the Biden administration actively pursued censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story prior to the 2020 presidential election, speech about the lab leak theory of COVID-19's origin, speech about the efficacy of masks and COVID-19 lockdowns, and speech about election integrity and the security of voting by mail. Now, the suit alleges the government infringed on our First Amendment right to free speech by getting big tech to label the content as disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation, as well as getting people and brands kicked off or suspended from platforms as punishment for daring to discuss these forbidden topics. Now, I've been wondering why no one has brought up a suit like this against the government. It's been obvious for years that lawmakers have been using various forms of intimidation and threats of regulation to get big tech to censor people and ideas. Democrats have been carting in big tech executive after big tech executive publicly demanding they do more to combat misinformation. They flat out told them to censor us, and they told them pretty publicly. So finally, someone is taking them to court over this. Now, whether or not you agree with any of these individual ideas, like the lab leak theory or election integrity, the government doesn't have the right to censor ideas, even bad ones or wrong ones. The government knows this. They can't censor themselves, so they found a little workaround through getting big tech to do it. Now, people have been screaming for years that big tech companies are private and can do whatever they want, including censor people and kick people off of their platforms. But if the government is holding them at knife point, are they truly making choices in the best interest of their business model? That's what Eric Schmidt is going to have to prove, that these big tech companies were not acting on their own volition for their own benefit, but instead because they were coerced or colluded with the government. And what the judge granted 2 days ago was Missouri's request for the case to move along quickly by allowing Attorney General Eric Schmidt to begin requesting from the government and big tech companies a whole host of documents, emails, and various correspondence between the two. They want to know who talked to who, when, and what they said exactly. So, of course, as expected, the Biden administration is simultaneously trying to get the case thrown out. So at this point, Eric Schmidt can ask for documents and subpoena big tech executives, but he'll be met with resistance each step of the way. These guys are not going to turn over documents and other discovery without a fight. So it's still too early to determine if Eric will actually get those documents in order to look under the hood, but he actually has a fairly strong case that could cause a judge to grant many of the document requests. After all, government officials were pretty brazen about their efforts to label ideas and topics counter to their narrative as misinformation. The administration even created a disinformation governance board. Also, if you remember the emails that leaked to Fauci coordinating with others to orchestrate a campaign to discredit the lab leak theory, who did he contact? What were the conversations? Were they coerced in some way or perhaps even offered something? In July of 2021, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said, "We're in regular touch with those social media platforms, and those engagements typically happen through members of our senior staff, but also members of our COVID-19 team. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation." Well, also in July of 2021, CNN reported that the White House was reviewing whether or not social media companies should be held legally accountable for misinformation. Kind of sounds like a threat. In fact, lawmakers and the administration's use of threat of eliminating Section 230 often. It's very possible and perhaps even likely that as a result, big tech regularly consulted with the government to find out what was the latest topic or who were the latest people the government wanted labeled as misinformation. Okay, so now for the big question. If, let's say, this lawsuit goes all the way and the ruling ends up being that the government did in fact collude and coerce social media to censor, infringing on our freedom of speech, what's the recourse? After all, many of us were affected by this. Here at The Hill, we were suspended. I've personally been suspended on my own channel and had posts removed that later ended up being accurate. There seems to be an endless list of people, shows, and posts wrongly labeled or removed. Can we sue the government? Unfortunately, no. The government has what's called sovereign immunity and can't be sued except in rare circumstances. Maybe some YouTube creators, Twitter users, and others who've been labeled or banned could get together and form a class action lawsuit against the big tech companies. That's possible. If Missouri ultimately wins this suit, others bringing forward cases becomes more likely. Another big question is, would a win ultimately force social media to change? There was a time not long ago when we weren't allowed to say the vaccines don't stop the spread. We weren't allowed to talk about the lab leak theory. We weren't allowed to talk about alternative treatments or debate the efficacy of masks or discuss elections or Hunter Biden. Some of this stuff we still can't talk about. There's plenty more I didn't list that's still banned. If this lawsuit goes all the way and Missouri wins, will these topics remain taboo? Or will Americans be able to discuss ideas and thoughts freely again? So I want to kind of explore this idea, Brianna, because I think a lot of people in particular feel like, okay, so if Missouri wins, what do we get? We just get like the moral victory on this. So we can't sue the government. I mean, this is crazy that there is this thing, sovereign immunity, that makes it to where if they're found liable for if they say, yeah, you guys infringed on Americans' freedom of speech, like then what?
Yeah, I mean, there are, I think, some limited exceptions under, I think it's called the Alien Torts Claim Act, where if you can prove that government was negligent in their behavior, but it's a really high bar to jump over, and it's very rarely allowed. Besides which, what we're describing here isn't necessarily negligence, right? It's these kind of affirmative choices that they made. And look, the ostensible rationale here is that the government has to make 1,000,001 decisions every day. It's very difficult. They're not going to get all of them right. If it were constrained by the idea of being vulnerable to lawsuits, then it would be completely ineffective and hamstrung and yada, yada, yada. But it presents some real issues, I think, like you've raised, that they can act with impunity. And we've discussed this in other contexts, as like with the criminal justice system and police having qualified immunity. There is a direct effect on how they go about doing their jobs and the impunity with which they corral, abuse, beat, shoot, imprison innocent people who have very little recourse at the end of the day. Even people who are falsely imprisoned and win their cases and get out of jail after years, decades, sometimes in jail, get very little in recompense.
There's a related or similar lawsuit that I think I've covered on the show. I at least wrote about it because I pulled up the article I wrote here, brought by the New Civil Liberties Alliance on behalf of specific users of, I think, Twitter, who lost their accounts or were punished. And what they're saying, and it happened right after guidance from either the Department of Health or some government official. And so they're suing those government officials, saying that it was improper for them to direct social media to take these actions that resulted in these specific clients facing problems. And that might be an even more plausible path to holding the government somehow accountable. But I do agree with you, Kim, and I think Republicans, conservatives, and then the broader tent of people who are concerned about big tech censorship. For a long time, the emphasis has been too much on the companies themselves, where at the end of the day, even if we disagree with what the companies do, like you said, it's a pretty hard from a legal standpoint to punish them for making moderation decisions you don't like. If we change the laws, that could be different, but under the current legal regime, it's very difficult. It's not quite as difficult, or at least in theory, to punish the government either by just voting out of office the people who do these kinds of things. Maybe it is difficult to sue them, but we can in some sense, we the people of America can either change the government or have some say in what the government's policies should be, much more so than the moderation decisions the company makes. So that should be the rightful method of directing change. It should be directed at the government who gives the bad guidance to the social media companies rather than threatening the social media companies themselves, in my view.
Right. Although recently a very large case was just won with Alex Berenson, who did win. He was banned from Twitter. He actually sued Twitter on the basis that they infringed upon his freedom of speech. He did settle that case. He's back on Twitter. And he can't talk about it exactly just yet. So we're waiting to find out, the details when Alex can talk about that at some point, or some of the things that he can say. Maybe he's writing a book about it. I'm not 100% certain like why he's not able to give us the details as how did he beat big tech. But that is I think that's like the only big example at this point where we're actually seeing the tide turn. The court of public opinion is shifting on this as well. People are starting to say, hey, wait a minute. A lot of these things that are happening don't seem really right. And so,
Right.
these companies are not going to win if they go to a jury trial, for example, perhaps, but
Right.
that's so. But I don't even know how often they would go to a jury on
Right.
something like this.
I don't know what happened in that case either. I'm interested to learn more about it if he's able to talk about it, or if anyone's able to talk about it.
At some point.
It might be a case of them just changing their mind about, well, we took you off because you made these claims, which at the time we thought were false, that we were directed to by the government. We no longer think they're false, so we're letting you back on. He claimed they actually said something, in them saying that he said something false. Now that we know that's not false, I don't know. We have to learn more about it. But you're right. That was an interesting development this week. Anyway, we'll have more Rising and more discussion on this topic and many others right after this.